Mr. Concise Engineering, ladies and gentlemen, I give you my friend and yours, the awesome Justin Bushko.
Morning, everybody.
Good morning.
All right, so I'm happy to be here. I run Concise Engineering and a small contract manufacturer as well. So we do design services for med device, and we also manufacture products, V&V builds and things like that to help the early entrepreneur get across the finish line. And we do pretty much everything in the engineering space, so mechanical, electrical, industrial design, firmware, et cetera. So if you anything along that line, I should be able to have some good conversations with you. And we're going to focus today on testing and V&V. So I've got some slides here. Let me just kind of share this screen real quick.
Couple things. Some of the folks at home might not know what V&V means.
Yep, we'll get into that.
And also, I've known Justin now for probably 10 years. We worked together some years back on his website. And if I'm not mistaken, when we did that, you were not a contract manufacturing person.
Correct. We, the contract manufacturing piece just started in 2021 due to some open issues with other clients. And we just wanted to help them get across the finish line.
Okay, so your needs weren't being met by existing contract manufacturers, so you went and put something together yourself.
Correct.
Interesting. Maybe we'll talk more about that. I'm sure Mr. Dimino will be interested to hear about that, as he too is a contract manufacturer. Maybe there's some synergies between you.
Location, Justin? I didn't catch that.
We're in Clearwater, Florida.
Clearwater, Florida.
Joe, I'm not seeing your typical share button.
On the very bottom, when you scroll to the bottom?
Oh, there it is. I just was minimized. There we go.
There we go.
All right, so
life-saving designs. We need a hyphen there, but otherwise perfect.
It'll probably change. Everything changes along the line. All right, so we're going to talk about V&V. And for those of you who don't know what V&V stands for, it's verification and validation, specifically design verification and design validation within the medical device space. And obviously, there are different ways that you can approach it, but there's always ways that you can go awry. And I'm going to do the best I can to kind of keep you on the straight and narrow and hopefully open your perspectives on a few things so that you can have a successful path forward. Why does V&V even matter? And I think this is something that's interesting to take a look at. If you look at just the 483 letters that happened over the last 4 years, there's nearly 1,000 483. In those, 100% of them had something to do with the QMS system. And if you are familiar with 483s, a lot of those touch on testing. So that's the primary one. There's some testing issues in there. Complaints. Complaint is the data that you're going to use for some of your initial analyses and understanding what could go wrong in the field. So 86% of the warning letters talk about not having good processes in that space. And then the last two here I've got listed is process and documentation, manufacturing related validations, and then design controls, which a lot of that points to improper requirements or verification validation. So you can see just in this here, the first one's about 1,000 letters over the last 4 years that say people aren't focusing, and down to just around 400 in the design control space where the QMS is not pushing them in the right direction. So this is not an uncommon issue. Lots of challenges in the med device space around testing and getting across the finish line. Anytime you're going through stuff, you're going to have people you're working with. So you got to remember, this is a team sport, right? So you're going to be doing affinity diagrams and risk management. You're going to be doing testing on your electronics or whatever. You may be doing some tensile testing, torque testing, et cetera, but you're definitely going to be having teams involved. If you're isolating yourself or trying to kind of guess your way through it, you're going to have some challenges. And in the med device space, I think we all know that the teams just keep getting bigger and bigger. So if you don't have 8 or 10 people talking about your product for some reason, you're probably leaving somebody from your team out, and you need to start thinking about how do you bring the right players into the room to ask that question that doesn't come front of mind for the people that are in the weeds.
I'm very intrigued by that. I've never heard if you don't have 8 or 10 people talking about your product. What are each of these functions as you define them?
Well, if you just look at the typical med device space, you're going to have a regulatory person, a quality person, someone that's typically in the design control space and documentation. You're going to have possibly 2 or 3 different engineers, maybe somebody that focuses directly on testing, and then a project manager. So that right there is about 8 folks. And all of them are going to contribute a different perspective. Now, do you have to have them all in one room? No, I mean, you can do this asynchronously, but getting the opinions involved in the communication of the product is definitely critical to, not doing what you did last time and maybe missing something new that, hey, a new warning letter came out and this is what Philips and Medtronic did on the last project. Have we covered those things? And just be aware, because not all engineers are going to be focused on that data that's flowing throughout the industry.
So Justin, quickly, Gunjan asked in the chat, what is a 483 letter and what other kinds are there?
Sure. So 483 is basically that initial statement from the FDA from an inspection that says it looks like you're doing something wrong and you probably want to work through these issues. And then you will respond to that and hopefully they'll say you're fine. If not, they're going to push further and they give you a warning letter. And if you really don't get your act together, eventually you can kind of go all the way to an injunction where you are not actually able to operate. Perhaps even have a armed officer at your door closing things down. So 483 there's the first formal response. And obviously, Michelle, if you want to chime in there, if I messed anything up, I'm happy to hear yours.
Yep. So that's correct. And the 483 Gunjan is it's the actual form number that FDA issues their inspection findings on, and you get a separate 483 for everything that they find. And then you have to respond to it in 15 days. And if you don't, then that's when it starts to escalate, or you respond inappropriately, it starts to escalate to what Justin was talking about with the warning letter.
Yeah. So if we get into design verification and validation, what does the FDA specifically require from us? I just want to touch on a couple things here. These are the definitions right out of the CFR 21. And in design verification, they really push on a few things. You have to have procedures, which is driven by your quality management system. You have to make sure that you have evidence that shows your design outputs meet your design inputs, and everything needs to be documented. So there's a whole lot of other stuff that goes on just to address those things, but these are the primary items that need to be addressed. And then in design validation, the same types of things come through. You still have to have procedures. You still need to document all your evidence. And now they talk a little bit about the fact that you need to have users, simulated use conditions, and be in this production equivalent zone. So you can't take an early stage prototype, do design validation, and say that you're done. You can do that, take credit for it, and then repeat it later as you get nearer and nearer to the end. But you don't want to ever assume like something you did on that early stage prototype is going to fly for design validation. So as we're talking, if it's not documented, it didn't happen. Complete waste of time if you're doing a test and you feel comfortable, because if you can't hand that test to somebody else and everybody else feels comfortable, you really didn't do anything of any value to your product. So you've got to document.
Joey is amused.
All right, so what are you documenting? When you're in looking at all the stuff that exists, this is one of like an excerpt from one of the performance testing guidance documents. So when you're completing a test report, we can kind of work backwards and see what do we actually need. A completed test report has to have the test that you performed, the objective of that test, the description of the test methods. So this would be if you have something that's not super clear, and why are you holding it in a certain way, or why are you bending it like this, describing how you came up with that and showing that you can do it consistently. The pass fail criteria, because we don't want to just run a bunch of tests and say, yeah, that looks like it's good. We need to stipulate at the beginning why, how many have to pass, what's the range we expect. If it's below a certain point, we consider those failures. So that all has to be in there. And then data analysis plan. This is if you're going to capture a lot of data and it's going to be potentially confusing for how it's going to be analyzed, you want to maybe do some pre-testing, figure out how you're going to look at the numbers, and then define how you're going to look at those numbers in there, because it's very easy to change your plan when you get the data. So defining it up front is going to be critical. Then you obviously document your test results and whatever your conclusions are. And then they just casually throw in there that Oh, and you also have to have a test protocol. It needs to exist before you actually run the test. It needs to be approved and reviewed by people. It's very difficult to go back, take old data, and rebuild a design history file with a whole bunch of remediated documents. Definitely not fun. Sometimes it can be done. Sometimes all of your test data is garbage and it has to be repeated. So these are the types of things that you need when you're running that performance testing. They don't tell you a whole lot, but working through someone that understands the issues is going to help. So make sure if you don't have a large enough team, you're looking for the right folks to assist in this path.
I'll pause here and ask if there's anyone who has a comment or something enlightening on this that they didn't know before. Robert?
So when I did my testing at Intertech, they gave me reports for like our electromagnetic interference testing, electrical safety testing. Intertech. I mean, I paid a lot of money for that stuff. According to your experience, those should meet these requirements since I paid so much money for those reports and that testing, right?
Kind of. So a lot of times you still need to write a wrapper around the report that will describe what they tested, why they tested it, what the issues were. One of this has been probably a decade ago, but they did a release and they had undefined EMC requirements that you had to define. And so if you don't define those ahead of time, you don't have true pass-fail acceptance criteria. And then also you're going to go through some EMC issues related to like immunity and other issues where your device gets a little flaky, maybe the screen flashes, maybe it resets itself. In the grand scheme of things, from a safety perspective, maybe none of those things matter. But if they're not defined somewhere within your planning and protocol documentation, those failures can be hard to justify later. And if it's not justified within the test reports, you end up with something that the FDA will immediately flag and say, perhaps you didn't test this correctly, and that puts your test in jeopardy.
But
So,
if I paid Intertech to do the IEC 60601 third edition testing, blah 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 blah, I would expect them as being professional laboratory scientists to already know this and done it, because that's why I went to them to pay them.
Yep,
Yeah.
I definitely understand the concern, but you typically need a third party to help make sure that that happens correctly, because they just do what you ask them to do, and they don't necessarily do it right every time. Now, I would tell you that Intertech does a pretty good job of making sure all these holes are buttoned up, so you're probably in a good place. If you had given me a different name of a company, I might be able to argue otherwise, but Intertech does a pretty good job. They do miss a few things, so it would be a good idea for you to review the test file, make sure they didn't put not applicable in a few spots where you actually need the test, because that happens. They might say you failed when you actually passed. So not checking their results, you can end up with problems that you weren't even aware of.
Okay.
Before I give the floor to those with their hands raised, I'm intrigued by Michelle's compulsion to say nope. What were you objecting to?
Oh, just any Intertech, Nelson, Woodsy, like any test laboratory. They're an expert in the test. They're not an expert in your product or your technology or your product features. And that part is up to you to be the expert in. And you have to have somebody to negotiate all that. Like for biocompatibility, there are tons of solvents, there are tons of extraction times, extraction temperatures. There's all these different factors. And it's up to you to know which combination. They can make some recommendations, but ultimately you have to select the one that's most appropriate for the intended use of your product.
Right. I appreciate that because I had to change some things because we had some cleaning materials in the operating room wipe the paint off the Da Vinci robots. So I get it. Like, and because I'm on the front rank, I get that. And I believe that according to what I was able to accomplish with Intertech, they did a good job. But I guess I still need another third party to help with the wraparound FDA document. So
Thank you for that, Robert. Nellie, you had something?
I was just going to kind of go into an element that maybe wasn't being considered is when you're using these testing labs, you actually have to do supplier qualification where you have an expert who can tell you that that laboratory is qualified to perform the work that they're doing. And you have to do that supplier control in advance. And so you can't, in the med device world, you don't trust anybody. You verify everybody. And so that's the best way to keep it. Don't even trust me. Verify it. Read the standards. Understand what you're doing. Because if you're trusting somebody else, you're actually handing yourself a 483 because you're not going to close in gaps.
Mark?
And I've seen things like you're mentioning there, Nelly, where they use the supplier perhaps overseas with the assumption everything's going to be fine, but it's significantly cheaper, only to find out that they weren't even an expert at the test. So what they get in the end is a 4 or 5 page document instead of the 50 or so pages you're expecting, and it's completely worthless. So you've lost time and money.
I have an example, just as a quick story. I have a client right now I'm struggling with who hired a contract manufacturer to do the entire design control for them. Okay. They've now submitted the 510K. I and the regulatory person in the company have not seen any documentation. They've now tried to issue a purchase order. They're not even FDA approved. And I'm literally writing, as we're speaking right now, what do you need in your system before you can issue a PO to your contract manufacturer? And so I'm trying to educate this person because they've cut every corner, even though you've advised them. So, I mean, it's a whole, I could literally give a whole topic on it.
Absolutely. Supplier controls is critical.
Yeah.
Mark?
Yeah, I've got it. Actually, I've been on both sides of the fence here before. As a prior R&D engineer in medical device, I've actually seen engineers and managers write up validations that did not pass, never could pass. I'd look at them and go, "There's no way this is going to pass." Force me to do it anyway, and you got to know ahead of time what it is you're testing. So you got to call out the right test and be able to test the right things and know what it is you're expecting to get out. And if you don't get it, then you can maybe put it on the supplier. The other side of that, as a QA manager, we sent some product out to have a really big sterile fill company out in San Diego who is past FDA, very, very highly respected, well known, and they screwed up our fill and threw some stuff away that they weren't supposed to throw away. So I got the batch records in, and I combed through the batch records to see what they were doing, and I saw that they were violating their yield, that they were not following the SOP, and their QA had no idea that this was happening. And they were like, "Well, we've been FDA approved or FDA inspected." It doesn't matter. You've got to do your homework. You got to know what the product is. And I completely agree with Michelle. You got to know what the product is. You have to know what you're testing for and why, what your parameters are. You've got to know all this and have it down cold before you test, because you don't validate to see if you validate. You validate to something that you know you're going to pass. So you pre-validate and do all your testing ahead of time just to make sure that it's going to pass. And then you send it to the real guys because you have an expectation of it's going to pass and what you should be getting back from your CMOs.
Absolutely. And there's a lot of, I've seen this, both electrical product safety, biocompatibility, and a lot of third-party tests where they do what they claim is their standard practice, and it never should have even been considered for your product. And you even maybe discussed it with them, and then they still violated it and destroyed your product. So definitely a lot of issues, and that create delays and loss of time and money.
Okay.
Oh, I'm sorry. So one last thing I wanted to say is Robert, yes, you do want to get somebody in who has been through this process a few times, and either with a regulatory person or a quality person, somebody who's been through this process before, who can look at what you've tested for, look at what your product design is, go all the way through to the end and see what you would be expecting out at the end, and make sure that it's all written up properly so that you're going to get back what it is that you've put into. So you want to get somebody who's got that experience, because they'll be able to see some things that either you didn't or maybe your supplier didn't, but if they can lay down a basis for a successful testing and reporting so that you can move on with your life.
Thank you, Mark.
So I just wanted to put this out there that in case people aren't familiar with the process, this is what the FDA produces. One of the original guidance documents that shows you how you do your reviews, your verification, validation. So in essence, your requirements are the white boxes in the middle, or the flow of your requirements that eventually end up in your traceability matrix. You would have your user needs that distills down into the design inputs that then you need to address by tangible outcomes, and that would be your design outputs. So you go through that design process to get your design outputs, which is going to be all the different evidence, the documentation, the actual parts, some of the inspections out of that, and then you'll have your medical device. And you're supposed to review it every stage. And here you have the design outputs have to meet the design inputs. That's your verification realm. Generally, you can think of this as anything that you're doing inside, in your lab, in your company. And then the validation side is where you're actually interacting with the users. You're looking at your KOLs, your doctors. They're handling your finished product. They're telling you that the labeling and the IFU is good. They're telling you that they feel like this product is safe and effective. And you can also lump in usability and some other things within this validation, but they are not the same. So you've got design validation for your product and usability validation for that aspect. And then you got software validation, which really kind of falls into the verification bucket, but that's, so there's a lot of nuances, but this is primarily what the FDA puts out there. And so the reason I bring this up is because I get down here to design outputs. Now I know what to verify. Well, if I messed up everything before that, I'm going to lose, right? So bad user needs, bad design inputs. I miss a bunch of features that are required. I test the output. I couldn't possibly be successful, or I could be, and my product is still terrible. So having more folks look at this stuff over time through these reviews, through cross-functional teams, is going to help you identify why this product is likely to be successful or unsuccessful when it gets into the field. When you're getting into this, here is another model that a lot of people use. This is the V model. This can be used in pretty much any way you want to view it. It could be just general requirements. It could be system level and all the distilled requirements. It could be just software requirements or anything along those lines. You could even build one of these for usability itself if you wanted to. But basically, it starts at the top left. You have your top level requirements for the user. Then you have your sub-level requirements, which are basically your design inputs and the sub-levels of those design inputs. And all of those lower ones are passing across to unit level testing, component testing, sub-assembly testing, system level testing, which is all verification. And then at the top, you're validating. So in general, this is how it works: is your mid-level requirements have like a mid-level test. So you might have a sub-assembly where you're testing things instead of the finished product, or maybe the finished product works and you can get into that sub-assembly. So this is one way that a lot of people look at it to make sure they're not skipping a step. Some people only come down a couple levels and go straight back up because you don't need to test the lower level components based on the risk of your product. And classifications of software and stuff like that will give you the right to do that. But there are a lot of tools out there like this, and it's useful to look at those different things. I built this one once from a software perspective, so people could understand how it tied to PEMS, which is one of the substandards for 6601.
I like that.
All right, when you're getting into design verification, there's a lot of different approaches that you can take. And I just wanted to kind of talk through just the general thought of what is verification and how might that apply to something else, just so we can kind of think through it. So if you're just going to show up somewhere and somebody's going to grant you access, can you get away with just providing some documentation, or do they need to know who you are by your fingerprint? Is this such a critical factor that they want all 10 fingerprints to make sure you're the right person? Maybe even get into biometrics or DNA to prove that you really are who you are. Thinking about these things is going to allow you to dig deeper into your product and understand what's really required, because the safety and efficacy of the patient is important. And if you don't go deep enough, you're going to have failures. And thinking through like what's really required for my product for this particular event is going to change things. And I wanted to kind of talk through a couple quick examples related to something pretty basic: screws. So you can see these 4 different products here. The top one on the left is an orthopedic screw. Then you got a spinal implant with a bunch of screws. You've got a bioabsorbable screw on the top right, and then you've got like a 3D printed lattice structure on the bottom right. Now you would think it's a screw. It's got to go in. It's got to hold. It can't break, right? So they all should be the same, but that's not the case. The one on the top left, obviously you have all those. You need to worry about rigidity and bending and stripping and cutting into the bone appropriately. But the next one down for the spine, you have to worry about compatibility with this plate, the angle of entry, whether or not it's going to gall with this other plate. Is the lock going to tie in? What are the tolerances there? What are the issues I'm going to have with compatibility from that? Do I have different types of metals that are going to influence this? So a lot of things that you didn't need on the first screw, you definitely need to think of on this set of screws. Biocomp, the biocompatibility one at the top. Obviously, everybody needs some kind of biocompatibility testing in this space, but now I need to worry about, are certain solvents going to impact this? That kind of comes back to what Michelle was saying. I also need to worry about, is this a specific polymer that has a cross-link structure that needs to be extruded in a certain way? If you extrude it longitudinally, it might work fine. If you extrude it the other way, it could actually break right along every thread. And the FDA may not even know that if that's your process. So you have to think through these things and make sure that you're identifying those requirements, because it wouldn't take but a couple minor errors in the production for you to spin the way something's being built and not be able to produce a good product. And the worst thing that would happen is if that happens after you've released the product. And then worse yet is this new 3D printed lattice structure. When you're going to do this type of submission to the FDA, all your manufacturing processes for the other ones really aren't critical, other than just to kind of give them a sketch of what's happening. But here you have to actually validate the entire 3D printing process on a specific printer with a specific media, how it's being done, the temperatures. So there's so much more that goes into it, but it's still just a screw. So you have to really understand, even though you have a bunch of screws, they all need to be treated differently, and you have to have the right skill set in the room. It's not a, I'll just assign this to an intern. It looks simple.
Hey, Justin, can I jump in real quick?
Yeah.
One of the other things that I've found that is probably just as important as your materials and your processes is natural manufacturing variability. A lot of people, when they're looking at the design, don't understand the manufacturing processes. And there are a lot of CMOs and CDMOs out there that don't really know their processes so well and understand from a process capability what they can actually put out of their machines, what their variability is. And sometimes it's the difference between pass fail. You can't always check these things. So according to 21 CFR 820.75, if the outcome of a process cannot be verified, it must be validated. So a lot of these things, there's too many small parts, like screws, for instance, is a really good example. And your biocompatible one there that would be absorbable is a great example, because and the spinal one too, because I've worked in spinal processes. Natural manufacturing variability is something you have to take into account to understand your success rate, because you can't just say, oh, okay, they made it. No, there's natural manufacturing variability that will stop you from actually using a product if you don't understand that you have a certain amount of lot tolerant percent defective, or LTPD, that are going to be bad. So you have to take that into consideration when you're starting this process as well. So the thing itself is important, but how to make the thing is equally as important.
Absolutely. And those tolerance stack ups and everything else that need to be addressed to make sure you have good mating parts are critical. And which features are the most critical for your product to be successful are generally looked at by the design teams, but there'll be quite a few that aren't super critical that could easily be missed, and then your part still doesn't go together. And while it's not going to influence the success of the safety of the product may not even be able to be manufactured, as you mentioned. Yeah. So having the right folks in the room to talk about all the different things and making sure you're changing your window of consideration based on the complexity of the product, especially if you're doing something new. If you think you've got this great new widget, then you probably have new issues that you haven't identified yet that somebody else didn't already test to, or maybe you're not even familiar with. So you got to start digging a little deeper. All right, when you get into failures, there's I can't say this is a complete list, but this is a pretty substantial list. You're going to find stuff where you didn't design it correctly. You're going to find something from a performance perspective where you didn't exactly meet a torque or a requirement. Ideally, you're doing all this stuff early and you're in the stage of design so that you're not finding out last minute, as Mark had mentioned before. You're going to have software errors and anomalies within your product. You may have some compatibility problems, and these could be related to different types of materials. It could be like we were talking about, tolerance stack up issues. Obviously, user interface problems, usability issues, where people are pushing the wrong button because of an icon, or they didn't realize they needed to push a button, different things like that. Safety hazards. This could be as simple as, like, you're making a blade. It's going to potentially cut somebody. So sometimes you have safety hazards that exist. Now you need to try to design around them, or design additional safeties into it so that you understand. Reliability and durability problems can cause you issues in the future. Regulatory compliance issues where you're not meeting a guidance document or a standard. And then just getting into not doing stuff right from documentation practice or not including enough stuff in labeling or instructions. And through your testing, you'll find most of this. I mean, if you're writing a test protocol and you're being accurate and you're writing lower level work instructions for exactly how to do it, you're going to say that, you know, based on the IFU, I told them to push these buttons and the software didn't work that way. That's a problem. Let's go back and figure out what's going on. Is it software or is it documentation? So you'll find this by going through your testing. So a dry run is always a recommendation. Talking through these, if we want a couple stories, you know, here are some things that I've seen in the past. You know, you have where tooling that didn't have a tolerance analysis that went all the way through to plastic injection molding and the parts never went together. So that's wasted money on tooling, wasted time. Typically that's like 3 to 4 months to just get good parts off, first shots off. And you find out the parts don't even mate. And the problem is this isn't rare. This stuff happens all the time because of new design teams or unwritten requirements. I've seen where you believe something's going to go in like a small screw. You're trying to do some testing, and as you go to test it, you find you have a very sharp edge. You just break the head off. Well, now what do you do? Now you have to do an extraction during a case. So there's a lot of small issues like that can occur. I'm sure you guys on the software side are aware of brick devices and undefined states. I've seen products where, you know, you have 4 buttons that exist and you normally put on some kind of little feature that presses 2 and this one presses this 2. So you don't define the state where 3 or 4 buttons are pressed. And what happens if one of those buttons fails? Now your product is garbage or goes into a reset cycle. We talked about failed biocompatibility testing. I've seen this happen probably 10 different ways, but a couple easy ones are you change the color of your product and they put a dye in it that was weird. You sent them the right parts and they decided not to do what you discussed, which I mentioned before, Mark, which is just like test the outside surface, but they threw the entire thing into a grinder, which had electronics in it. You can be guaranteed to fail. And there's a lot of issues in biocompatibility from a bioburden perspective or an unclean environment prior to shipment. You know, you get mold growth or some other thing on the back end where all the materials are fine, but you still don't pass the test. On the material issues for sterile product, you can imagine if you make an error there and you find out that you're probably not going to pass biocompatibility, or maybe your device is starting to merge with the PETG or merge with the Tyvek, which can happen in shelf life. Those things set you back sometimes 9 months or a year. So you need to know that somebody's done this before, or you've seen it before, or pre-test some things to make sure that you don't have those issues. I think that's enough little stories. Everybody have anything else?
Justin, could you explain that thing with the Tyvek merging with another material real quick?
Yeah, when you're doing typically it's like a shelf life study or a real-time aging study. The product itself, depending on how you package it, could be in contact with the seal layer. Right. And over time you get like a cold flow of those materials and they will merge. And when they merge, you then cannot claim that the sterile barrier still exists, because like you would basically peel it off and there could be holes there, right? And so you can't use that product. And that generally results in a recall if you don't catch it early in the design. It could happen, you know, if you have a 3-year shelf life or something like that, it'll happen in the field, and then there's no way to resolve it other than bring all that product back.
Thank you.
Yeah, Justin, in addition to that, you've got various different ways to sterilize too. So you've got ETO, you've got radiation, you've got E-beam, and all these do vastly different things, and they can interact with your product as well. So there's that kind of testing to determine what's the best way to sterilize. And then obviously the sterilization validation is something that has to be done to ensure that, you know, you meet all your parameters.
Absolutely. And we're seeing there's a new one now. Well, it's not new, it's been around forever, but chlorine dioxide is now getting a lot of traction.
Oh yeah. How are they using that? Is that a gas or
it's a gas. It's basically like it's what the USDA has been using to treat fruits and stuff like that forever.
Oh,
right? So,
right.
but it's very critical on the temperature and things like that. So you have to have it just right in order to do it well. But it has significantly less restrictions than ETO. So it's an ETO potential replacement if anybody wants to try to move in that direction. I've seen some people are actually converting their ETO chambers to do that. Quite a few changes have to be made, but you can move in that direction.
So I have a story that it's just recently, I have a client who has a med device that has firmware on it. They were only focused on the device, not the firmware. So when they went to do their 60601 testing, they realized they had never released the firmware. They had no design control documentation on it. And so it's like, they're like, Nelly, what do we do? And I'm all, well, you need to release it. And they're like, well, we're not ready. And so I came up with a method to at least do an engineering release where we pulled all the draft documents so we could create a timeline, because I said, guys, here's what's going to happen. You're going to go do your 60601 testing. Then an inspector is going to come in and say, well, that's invalid testing because you never validated the firmware. And so I like, let's at least create something that shows that it's done. Because when you go to release and do all that, you can say, look, compare, it's exactly the same. And that's how you're not going to invalidate it. But they argued with me because they didn't want to put the draft documents with the engineering. And I'm like, okay, guys, do what you want. But I guarantee you, when you're sitting there in front of an inspector, they're going to go, you have to redo your 60601 testing. And that's not a cheap ticket.
No. And actually, from a software perspective, generally, the test house wants to review your documentation, all your risk management files, and they can even not give you a final report. So it will say you passed, but there'll be something in there about software where it says like not tested. And that bites you on a 510K as well, because they'll see that and go like, what do you mean you didn't test this? This is critical, like especially if there's safety features built into your software.
There is none. This one is very simple. It's firmware. It's just turning a light on and off. But the point of the matter is, to me, they're like, well, that's not important for the device testing. I'm all, do you have to verify in the 60601 testing that light turns on? I go, it now becomes.
Yep.
And they're like, they don't think they're dismissing it as not important. And I'm all, I mean, I got it through, but the point of the matter is having the discussions to do that was problematic.
David?
Go ahead, David.
Yeah, so I just wanted to add a comment on sterile packaging on product. You know, I've seen questions from the agency about transfer of something from the packaging to your product. Just it's infrequent, but I've seen it. The other thing I wanted to mention, just, you know, especially when we do drop, kick, and roll, whatever we call it, shipping testing, if you have sharp edges, you can pierce the Tyvek, you know, and you can break your sterile barrier. For those who don't live in this world, it's just a different failure mode that can appear and testing that you need to, you know, complete. If you intend to ship, you have to know that you can ship. If you intend to ship and put it in a FedEx airplane, you need to have some data to support what those temperature ranges look like. You know, the storage temperatures in your warehouse, and will your product survive? Will your packaging survive? Will your packaging seals survive? That's just all I was going to add. Thanks, Joe.
Yeah, and actually, along those lines, I have seen the transfer stuff occur because somebody added a tip protector. So the tip protector itself, keeping it from poking a hole, then starts to merge with a Tyvek later, or creates a biocompatibility or sterilization failure due to the bioburden issues on the tip protector. So even then, when you're trying to fix something, you can still create unintended consequences. Good.
Maren?
What was that, Joe?
He was asking for Maren. Yeah, I'm here. I wanted to just make a quick comment. I agree with all the comments made earlier about testing to standards and making sure that the company identifies the requirements. I also just wanted to note that not all the verification required for a standard is testing. In some cases, the clauses ask for things like, do you have a quality management system, or do you have a risk management procedure? So some of the clauses in the standards, the test houses aren't going to be able to do for you. The company actually has to get the verification results for those.
Yeah, absolutely. On the electrical safety side, you actually have to fill out an entire risk management documentation package. So that covers that. It also covers a lot of the quality aspects and how you're going to do CAPAs and things like that within those clauses as well.
Yeah, so you can't just bump the verification for a standard to an agency and expect them to do it all. They won't have all the information.
Makes sense. Yep. I think when you're going through testing and preliminary testing, you can almost kind of judge where do you not need to test, right? And it's not normally that you're going to justify no testing, but here in this image, don't test this. It's a bad idea, right? We failed in design. Let's go back to the drawing board before we start wasting our time trying to test. So there are times when you can simply look at the product and realize it's not going to meet the needs. These parts didn't go together well. It's clearly not what we need. You can attempt to test it. This one I wouldn't test. Another thing that you can get into is, as I mentioned, buttons. What are you doing to challenge your user interface? Could your user push every button? What's going to happen? Could they push more than one button or buttons out of sequence? Oftentimes we'll follow the IFU and just go through the what they call the clean case or the happy case, because that's what they're supposed to do. And if they do that, it should work. Well, they can do a whole bunch of stuff. Is that going to cause your device to reset, put you in an undefined state, have your product crash or perform unsafely? This is where, like, you could push the wrong button and your microwave turns on when the door's still open, right? And there's a lot of fault tree analysis and stuff that can be done on the defense side, where you push this wrong button and you accidentally fired a rocket, even though you had 2 keys and double lockout buttons, but one small thing in a circuit can cause the whole thing to fail. So you got to look for those types of challenge tests. So if you're trying to be successful in this realm, just kind of mapping through a little bit of what we talked about, the design requirements are key. You need to know what you're designing and why, and you need to look at risk management. Now, we haven't really talked about risk management that much, but in general, risk management is going to do the analysis of all the ways you're going to fail. You're going to be looking at your predicates that are in the field. You're going to be looking at MDRs and adverse events and things that have gone wrong, and understand what those are and how those define additional requirements for your product. Then you're going to start planning out exactly what you're going to do for testing. In that planning, you're going to realize you don't even know how to test certain things. So you're going to invent new test methodologies, and you're going to figure out those test methods. Then you have to document your test protocols, make sure that you know all the steps that need to occur. You know, if you do it out of order, you might actually create a different type of failure mode, or you might pass if you do it in the wrong order. So you got to work through those details and understand what needs to be done, write those test reports, and then consistently be reviewing this stuff, because you may have issues where you find something in a design review or in a discussion that doesn't seem like it's covered elsewhere. And there's definitely things that you need to look at. A couple kind of warning signs, you know, as you're going through a product and you're trying to figure out what needs to be addressed. If you see that there are predicate complaints out there and you have no evidence that it's not going to happen to your product, you probably have a concern that you need to address. Maybe you can justify why your product wouldn't possibly fail in that way, but not having any evidence at all is probably a bad idea. You might even want to just write something up to justify why you don't need to test, because it'll probably be asked for at some point. When you're going through and you find guidance that you forgot to test to and you have no evidence to support, that's going to be a red flag. You're going to need to go back and figure that out. In some cases, and I find this very frequently, where I have evidence of a test, but I don't have any requirement or any risk telling me I needed to run that test in the first place. So if the team felt that they needed to actually go do something, they need to go figure out how to write that as a requirement, because you probably have missed something else in your product as well. More along the lines of like water cooler discussions, you're just wandering around the office and people are always saying, I'm really worried about this. Well, if there's not a requirement or a risk related to that, maybe you should sit down and talk through that. You will have some people that worry about everything, and it's not necessarily something that needs to be documented. But if it becomes a little bit bigger, you definitely want to make sure it's covered somewhere, or maybe even write up why we were concerned and why it doesn't matter, because somebody in the FDA could have that same concern, or another consultant or something. And then I think the last thing you always need to be aware of is when you're starting to see failures and you're trying to justify them away, right? Sometimes this is valid. There could easily be, you know, something was built wrong and then you had tested it anyway, but you know, that should have never happened because you should have had good parts going into your test. So you missed something on your procedures and your processes there anyway. So if you're justifying something, something's broken somewhere and you need to figure out what that is for preventative maintenance. But more importantly, you need to make sure that your requirements are built as needed, so you're testing appropriately.
Justin.
Yeah.
I just realized you're in the same town as my chief engineer. How fortuitous is that?
Oh, that's crazy. I'll have to, maybe I know him.
Yeah, Bob Dobbins.
I don't know, Bob. I'll have to meet him.
Yeah, I think I'm gonna put you two in touch.
Yeah, it's always good to meet people, especially when they're local. It's awesome.
Yeah, because yeah, I need to get this in the OR. I'm kind of tired of not having it in the OR, and I need it in the OR before I need my surgery. So I'm gonna put the pedal to the metal on this.
All right, sounds good. Look forward to it. All right, so I just want to go through kind of like, what are you experiencing in your path here going through things? And I found a bunch of analogies that I've used in the past or that exist in med device or just design in general. Typically, these are related to solving a problem or working through a failure. So in this case,
Justin,
yeah,
we'll go as long as you have. I just want to manage the group's expectations. We're at an hour. How
okay.
many more slides do you have?
I just have it's just a couple of descriptions here, but I can go faster. So
No, you don't. I just
5 minutes.
wanted to just manage people's time. A few have dropped off.
yeah, no worries.
And I know
had
Verna had something she wanted to contribute.
I was just gonna, I'm just gonna mention that I've experienced in the past, one thing that you didn't mention that folks probably maybe just take for granted, but I've had a situation where people didn't do it right, is start with make sure that all the equipment that you're using is calibrated and has a proper preventative maintenance, and has an installation qualification and an operational qualification. Because if you don't have that, even in your test equipment that's in R&D, then you could have everything else is perfect, but it's not going to be a valid report. And so they better be labeled, and you better have documentation on that equipment.
I've actually been a part of one, not recently, but a couple of years ago, where they had to re-execute 3 major protocols because nobody qualified the equipment that was being used during that protocols.
Yeah, and you also have to have remediation processes in place for that same thing, because even though it was calibrated, when it gets calibrated next and it fails, you need to know what might possibly need to be recalled, rejected, retested, etc. And I've had where product gets basically quarantined because you don't know what it was used for. And so it's definitely a challenge, especially if it could impact safety and efficacy. All right, let me jump ahead here and I'll just talk quickly about some of these things just because I think they're fun to see. From a failure perspective, sometimes you're going to see issues where you're just, every time you look a little deeper, you're peeling another layer of the onion off, right? So just one perspective that you want to have is let's just get digging, because if you had a problem, it could be a process, it could be a piece of equipment, like you mentioned, Verna. There could be some other way that you're having a problem and you want to dig through that. This other one, the iceberg, I always like that because you only see what's on the surface, but every time you maybe knock that down or figure it out, it comes back up again. So something's always at the surface and you need to figure that out. You could be dealing with an issue that's like dominoes, where you just touch one and everything falls apart. That makes it a hard thing to diagnose. You could be looking for a needle in a haystack. Whack-a-mole actually is more tied towards like EMC issues, right? Where you fix one problem and it pops up somewhere else and you're always fighting it. And it's hard to track because it's invisible, or it could be a software problem similar. And then worse yet, you could be this guy here at the end of this cliff. Everything's been fine. He feels like he's perfectly safe and he's just enjoying himself because he's successful. But 3 years out in the field, something crazy goes wrong because you weren't paying attention. You didn't test something. Your risk files weren't done well 5 years ago. You want to keep all those things in mind. So just in summary, I believe, this, to be successful, it's a team sport. So you have to have enough people on your project to have the opinions necessary in order to be successful. Data exists everywhere, so you need to be looking for it. It's on the FDA sites. It's in, communication with different people that have done this before. It's through LSI or basal systems or something else. You've got that data out there. You need to have processes and analysis to go through, and this is driven by risk management in your quality system. You got to document everything, analyze all your fears and failures, because if you're worried, it could be an issue. If you failed already, that's probably an issue. Look through that, and then just keep monitoring the data that's out there and the recall notices, because those could, in essence, help you identify something that never really showed itself in the field yet, and you could actively work to correct it. That's all I had. Sorry for running over, Joe.
I would hardly apologize, and that's all I had after presenting a solid hours.
It felt like it was going to be shorter.
And it went longer because you engaged us and people had things to add and questions to ask. So thank you for that. I'm glad I chased you down to give this presentation. We need to see more of you.
I appreciate it. Thank you, Joe.
Friends, I have no one scheduled yet for next week. So if there's a topic of particular interest, or Verna, if you happen to be off because you just graduated a class, you have a little extra time, maybe you can be our presenter next week.
Yeah, actually I can, because I'm going to be on vacation, but I'll be back on Thursday. So
Verna's our
Friday-
speaker next week, everyone.
Nice. Congratulations.
And perhaps Olu, in a couple of weeks, we'll have you present, even though you're still in this formative stage. We use the time as a way for us from different angles to hear what your challenges are. We might be able to kick up some things that you might not be aware of.
Yes, sir. That sounds good. Thank you.
So we'll do that. We have kind of chilly weather up here in the Pacific Northwest today. I don't know what this week shy of summer's weather looks like for you all, but I hope you enjoy it, and we'll see you next week, starring Verna. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Justin,
Thank
great
you.
presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, Joe. Have a good day, guys.
Thanks, everybody.